Were the divine beasts that bad? A very common criticism of Breath of the Wild, particularly from people who for some reason hold the old Zelda titles a little too close to their hearts, think that the divine beasts in Breath of the Wild were lacking. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having Twilight Princess or Wind Waker as your favorite Zelda title, but saying Breath of the Wild doesn't hold a candle to Ocarina of Time or A Link Between Worlds is crazy. Like, bro, Breath of the Wild doesn't hold a candle to Ocarina of Time in what regard? Probably something irrelevant like the music. Again, I really don't care if you like Majora's Mask over Breath of the Wild, for instance, but these are the same people that say that Breath of the Wild isn't a Zelda game or enough of a Zelda game. I mean, for one, holding the latter as an opinion is indicative of the fact that you're pushing 40, and two, these are the same people who think that Breath of the Wild's dungeons are lackluster and therefore ruin their Breath of the Wild experience. Because in this definition of lackluster, what we really mean to say is not like the older Zelda titles in their dungeons. So naturally, when I could conflate people who think Breath of the Wild's dungeons are bad and people who think Breath of the Wild is bad because Link can't play a fucking flute, I tend to ignore such criticisms. So if that's the case, what is this video doing on YouTube? Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, as the saying goes. The goal of this video is to take a look at the dungeons, or in Breath of the Wild's case, the Divine Beasts, to see if they really are as bad as what some people say. However, we will be holding the Divine Beasts up to a standard in which Breath of the Wild set, not the older Zelda games, because, to be frank, I could give two fucks about how Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, or Twilight Princess structured their dungeons. Okay, let me be more professional and give you the actual reason why. The old Zelda formula worked for, well, the older Zelda games, but in this day and age, that shit just needed to go. Back in the day, Zelda games were the most expansive kind of games that you could play. Being able to run around in a 3D environment, have lots of different tools at your disposal, along with being able to search different fictional environments, was such a cool concept that the video game genre didn't yet see much of. This was realized in 1998 with the debut of Ocarina of Time, taking the top-down 2D style from The Legend of Zelda, Adventures of Link, and Link's Awakening, and revolutionized it with the implementation of a 3D setting. Majora's Mask followed, then there was The Wind Waker, which sort of re-revolutionized from Ocarina of Time. The Wind Waker added new and interesting mechanics, along with a new setting and an interestingly unique art style. A few years later, in 2006, Twilight Princess was released, giving Zelda a more realistic art style. This was definitely a lot more expansive than The Wind Waker, adding even more new elements, settings, and concepts. Then after that, you have Skyward Sword, a pretty divisive title, probably due to how the game controlled on the Wii. The art style was if Twilight Princess and The Wind Waker had a baby. There was a plethora of environments to explore, new enemies, and intuitive puzzles. But one thing that was clear about Skyward Sword was the fact that Nintendo was following the old style / formula of Zelda. The jump from 2D to 3D was made in 12 years, but that was only after 4 titles and after the debut of the series. The jump from 3D to something else took 20 years in over a course of 11 titles. And if that's not one reason to change, let's take a look at Skyward Sword. Like I said, Skyward Sword followed the formula of all the other Zelda titles that were 3D. However, definitely to a fault. The entire game felt way too linear. Everything was very objective based to a degree in which I felt like I was completing a dungeon just to get to the dungeon. Even the combat felt extremely compartmentalized from the game itself. For instance, when fighting an enemy, your movement becomes limited, your vision narrows, and completely locks onto the enemy. When fighting, it feels like there's a lack of depth and or intuitiveness, and rather feels like there's a precedented way or a specific way you're supposed to fight enemies. This extends to the dungeons also. You'll find an item and use it to solve puzzles which are supposed to be deciphered in a very specific manner. And taking a step back, this is literally the case with all of the previous 3D Zelda games. Although expansive at times with the use of different and unique tools, the combat in general is pretty stiff, or controlled may be a better word. You gain specific items in dungeons so that it can be used as a scapegoat for a concept whose existence would otherwise seem so bizarre, and the structure of the game gives you the illusion of a more open environment, except you can't interact with much of anything meaningful which doesn't steer you in the direction of the objective. So with all these facts, and with the scope of gaming rising beyond linear puzzle-solving games, Nintendo re-revolutionized the Zelda franchise once again. With the implementation of Zelda being held in an open world, not only did Nintendo reinvent the Zelda franchise, they made one of the best games the gaming industry and community have ever seen. Implementing the old Zelda formula and tweaking it to fit in an open world where you have so much seamless freedom and world interaction worked out for the best. Link was finally able to jump, and climb on his own accord, something that was never a thing on any of the previous Zelda games. You could also progress the game at your own pace and choose your own path in doing so. The combat was not only diverse, but it also didn't feel compartmentalized and was rather a natural occurrence of the world you were in. I feel like a lot of die-hard Zelda fans don't have enough respect and appreciation for Breath of the Wild, and it skews their perception of certain aspects of the game, which is by far the most ambitious Zelda title. I'd also go as far as to say that it's objectively the greatest Zelda game ever made. When comparing the Zeldas to what they did with the franchise, then Breath of the Wild is tied with Ocarina of Time. But relative to each other, without question, Breath of the Wild is the better game. I mean, obviously, it's basically a fact. And to be honest, I think that any reasonable person would agree with that. And this is why I will not be comparing the Divine Beast to a standard that the older Zeldas have set. For the reasons I stated prior, it would be silly and unproductive to do so. We'll be judging the Divine Beasts by how they impacted Breath of the Wild. So now with all that out the way, let's get on to the video. Of course, with the change in formula, the signature Zelda dungeons had changed to fit with the open, intuitive world of Breath of the Wild. Again, we'll be judging the dungeons by the standard Breath of the Wild set for itself. That's not to say some shrines were easy or not that good, so relatively speaking, the Divine Beast puzzle is good. No. We'll be judging the Divine Beast by the mechanics Breath of the Wild introduced. We all know that Breath of the Wild composed a very expansive world that pushed the potential of player intuition based on the tools it gives to the player's disposal. The dungeons are supposed to be the pinnacle of that department of the game, testing the player's intuition with the knowledge of the game that Breath of the Wild gives the player leading up to that point. A coherent example, or examples, would be, you know that you can cut down trees to make bridges, or cut down trees and use stasis as they're falling in order to make an incline to a platform. You know that you can use cryonis to move doors, which were placed above water. You know that you can manipulate electricity by using metal objects. And with that, we'll get into an overview of the Divine Beasts before judging them one by one. Divine Beasts were a pretty clever tool to maneuver the player's interest in the story, being placed and belonging to 4 respective regions and races spread throughout all 4 corners of Hyrule ensures that the player will gain some adequate game experience before reaching them. For instance, on a first playthrough, simply traversing to Vah Ruta will teach the player how to navigate wet surfaces and electric enemies. Vah Rudania teaches the player how to navigate both levels of the intense heat. Vah Medoh gets the player's feet wet in terms of dealing with the extreme cold, but not to a substantial extent. And finally, Vah Naboris teaches the player how to deal with the heat and cold at the same time via the temperature system of the desert. Now before we review the dungeons or Divine Beasts, it's important to look at them holistically. The Divine Beasts within Breath of the Wild exist within a certain format. The aspects comprising that format we'll be taking into consideration when judging the Divine Beasts. This format is comprised of the presentation of a problem, a mandatory mission or prerequisite task, boarding the Divine Beast, the puzzle, then finally the boss fight. With that being said, we'll begin our review of each aspect while focusing on each individual Divine Beast, starting with Vah Ruta. Vah Ruta takes the form of an ancient elephant which has the ability to eject water from its trunk. It resides in the East Reservoir Lake, a large lake southeast of Zora's domain. The presentation of a problem is that Vah Ruta endlessly sprouts water from its trunk, causing a torrential downpour which results in flooding. Now I would point out that taking this problem at face value is uncompelling. We don't see anybody affected by the flooding, no NPCs have died as a result of the flooding, no major areas were blocked off. However, this is a flaw of Breath of the Wild and not the Divine Beast. I can also assert this to the rest of the Divine Beast, but we'll get into that later. Now practically, this is a good presentation of a problem. When it rains in Breath of the Wild, surfaces become almost insurmountable to climb. The constant downpour forces the player down into a certain path, consisting of the Lanayru wetlands, then the Zora River, onto the Ruto Mountain, and then finally Zora's Domain. This is because Zora's Domain is surrounded by mountains on all sides, making it impossible to take an alternate and easier direction. Now there are ways around this, take it from me as someone who's replayed this game over 10 times, but the ways around this, quote unquote, are not too substantial and don't really cheat you out of an experience. If you start at the Lanayru wetlands, then Prince Sidon will also introduce himself to you and enlist you for help. When taking the path, you will encounter some river enemies such as the Octoroks and primarily Lizalfos. To some, this will be the very first time they encounter a Lizalfos. The path from the Lanayru wetlands to Zora's domain is something that you likely won't forget, and it's a standout moment in the game. Seeing the synergy between water and electricity is something to be wary of, but it's also something that you can take and use to your advantage. Once you actually get up Zora's domain and are ready to help the Zoras with Vah Ruta, you will be given a Zora chest plate. This now introduces you to a feature of swimming up waterfalls, a pretty useful feature, and honestly I wish that it was used more in the game. Outside of the main quest, I find myself only using the chest plate for convenience, but that's besides the point. The mandatory mission before boarding Vah Ruta is going up to Ploymus Mountain and retrieving 25 shock arrows. This is ass. Now, let me explain. Ploymus Mountain is where a red mane Lionel resides. This will probably be the very first time a new player has seen a Lionel, and thus probably won't be prepared for it. Nintendo knows this, and so designed the mission to have the player sneak around the Lionel while taking the shock arrows off of the ground and surrounding trees. Now, this does do a successful job in making the Lionel, probably the best enemy type in the game, more menacing. However, the objective is just silly. If you just so happen to already have 25 shock arrows, you don't need to do this mission at all. And furthermore, this is not the only location where you can get shock arrows. I remember in 2017 when I first played this mission, I decided that it was too much of a hassle and just ran to Lurland Village and bought shock arrows. Exhibit B, in Vah Naboris' mission, you had to have 20 bomb arrows, but Riju just gives them to you, so why do I have to go on a fetch quest for 25 arrows? Sure, the mission makes a good use of the Zora's chest plate, which does make getting to Ploymus Mountain a whole lot more convenient, but in any case, the object of the mission is just lackluster. Once you do get 25 shock arrows, you meet Prince Sidon at East Reservoir Lake, and the boarding process of the Divine Beast begins. And for the record, there was only one good, or I should say acceptable, boarding of the Divine Beast process, and this was not that one. All in all, it was okay, but definitely nothing special. You ride on Prince Sidon's back as he swims rapidly throughout the lake. During this time, Vah Ruta will generate spike balls and blocks made of ice and will shoot them at you. Nice and slow too, so you'll have time to break them using Cryonis. Once you break all of them, Sidon allows you to swim up one of the waterfalls that Vah Ruta produces, and from there, you go into bullet time and shoot one of 4 weak spots with shock arrows. And if you have enough stamina and a strong enough bow, you can shoot multiple weak spots in 1 bullet time. Personally, a new player is supposed to do it in 4, but I did it in 2. I'd say the average player shouldn't have a problem doing it in 3 sequences. After this, you board the Divine Beast and enter its puzzle. Now, the Divine Beasts follow the structure of entering it, walking quite the distance before applying the Sheikah Slate to a guidance stone, and replacing the world map with the one of the Divine Beast. It's here that you'll see 5 terminals, which it is your objective to activate. All of the maps are pretty good and provide decent enough information in terms of where you are in respect to the terminals. It's at this point where I will also point out the impressiveness with the Divine Beast scale and physical design. If you don't know already at this point in the video, the Divine Beasts take the form of a giant elephant, lizard, bird, and camel respectively. All the puzzles seamlessly tie into the inside and different parts of the Divine Beast's body. Also, maneuvering the Divine Beast's body to uncover certain puzzle pieces was a great concept. Also, being able to take on any terminal in any order was a giant step in the right direction. It plays off of the non-linearity of Breath of the Wild's open world, and although it's mandatory that you do complete the puzzles, you can still set your own path and progress in a way that is unique to you. This positively stands out from the previous Zelda game's more linear dungeons. The music is also something that I'll be remiss if I didn't comment on it. The Divine Beast is still infected by Ganon's malice. With that in mind, not only does the Divine Beast use the same instruments as the corresponding location's theme, but it also briefly uses the same sound effects to that of the Blights. This gives you the feeling that the blight is watching over you as you progress. The music also progresses as you progress, giving the player a slight bit of urgency and or a feel of progress while taking on the puzzles. Also, after doing a little bit of research, I found that the game developers even included Morse code in the Divine Beast themes. This was supposed to signify the champion's call for help, as they, of course, ended up dying in the Divine Beast. The crazy detail behind this crazy detail is the fact that the Morse codes from the different Divine Beasts have different characteristics, each based on the different champion that died within them. For instance, Revali's SOS Morse code didn't appear until the end of the loop due to Revali's inflated ego. This signifies how he was most likely reluctant to call upon help, as all the other Morse code sounds appear in the beginning of the loop. We hear bangs right before and during Urbosa's Morse code, suggesting that she didn't call for help until she got struck by lightning. It's details like this that separate the good games from the great ones. Going back to Vah Ruta, the part of the Divine Beast which you control is obviously the trunk, a good and obvious move. Now, I could commend Vah Ruta's puzzles for being comprehensive and intuitive to the player. However, it was blatantly too easy for the scale that it is. For the sake of this video, I purposely went back and played all the Divine Beasts without the aid of the internet. Now, I do have a lot of experience with this game and do remember some of the puzzles. With that being said, I made a note while reviewing the Divine Beasts to also look at it through the lens of the average player. And the average player should be out of Vah Ruta's puzzle in less than 30 minutes, and even that's pushing it. The first of 5 terminals simply has the player use magnesis to turn a crank a couple of times, which raises a terminal out of water. And yeah, that's 1/5 of the Divine Beast puzzles. I mean, seriously, Nintendo. Maybe having multiple cranks while having some that reset after a short period of time would have been better, or multiple cranks that had to be cranked in a specific order based on, I don't know, symbols that are embedded on the wall nearby would have been a decent start. This is likely the very first terminal a new player will ever go to, period. You know, given the fact that 90% of players will take on Vah Ruta as their first Divine Beast, and this is how we're starting off? This is the first impression? The second terminal cannot be accessed without running into an enemy, which is a topic we'll get into now. The Divine Beasts were criticized for its lack of enemy variety, something the older Zelda games made sure to include in their dungeons. Now, this criticism is something that I agree with to an extent. Although I don't think a ton of enemy variety is necessary in dungeons, as it could be used as a cheap way to make the dungeon harder, on top of the fact that a dungeon is supposed to highlight puzzles, the lack of enemy variety was a missed opportunity on Nintendo's behalf. The dungeons will be comprised of Guardian Scouts, Malice Eyeballs, and Cursed enemies. All of these enemies are very easy to beat and can easily be relegated as mere annoyances. For instance, before entering every Divine Beast, there's a Malice Eye which will block your entrance, and I'm using the word block in quotations, because there's absolutely nothing preventing the player from leaving the eye alone and simply jumping over the obstruction without consequence. In terms of missed opportunities, we could have seen possible enemies unique to each dungeon. Maybe small Guardian snipers which will fixate on you while having a laser similar to a Guardian Stalker. Maybe some actual enemies. I mean, story-wise, these things were piloted by the champions, so how or why isn't there any security measures preventing anyone or anything from operating the beasts? Going back to Vah Ruta again, the second puzzle requires the player to stop a mechanism that is generating water, which moves a giant cog. Within this cog holds another terminal. You'll have to stop the cog at the right time by using Cryonis, but again, this is a very easy puzzle to figure out. If you actually see the terminal inside the cog, the average player should be able to figure it out in under a minute. Next to this is a larger cog. This larger cog is activated by moving Vah Ruta's trunk, causing it to splash water and rotate said cog, similarly to how the smaller cog was being moved by the previous water generator. It's more of this that was missing from the dungeons. Mandatory in-between steps which require thinking and brain power. A good dungeon puzzle doesn't always have to be overt in the objective, rather have prerequisite objectives which gives you access to the objective at hand. The third terminal requires you to travel further up the Divine Beast, during which you will see a Malice Eyeball and a Cursed Mouth which spews cursed monsters if the eyeball isn't taken care of. It also blocks your path, making it a mandatory encounter. Once you reach this level, you will see a ball which, when activated on its socket, creates energy, which opens the door to another terminal. This, however, is on the inside of the larger cog, so gravity will take its toll and force the ball out of its socket right when the terminal becomes level with the player's platform. This causes the door to the terminal to shut due to a lack of power being supplied to it. The solution is to perform stasis on the ball and freeze it in time so that it stays in its socket by the time the terminal becomes level with the player's platform. This will cause the door to remain open and the player can access the terminal. Now, this isn't a bad concept. Could it have been expanded? Yes. This function could have given us access to a door to a room, which would contain similar and smaller puzzles like this. But to me, this is the first acceptable puzzle, but it's nothing crazy or special by any means. The average player should be able to look at this contraption once and figure out what to do by the time the cog makes its next revolution. The fourth terminal requires you to push a button to permanently activate a waterfall below you. Jumping down, then climbing up this waterfall using the Zora chest plate will give you enough momentum to launch higher in the air and onto the higher platform above you. However, in my case, I did this fourth terminal last, as did most players. In any case, you'll need to destroy a Malice Eye, which gives you access to another cog crank, using magnesis to open a door above you. Now, you need this door because the terminal is surrounded by flames, and moving Vah Ruta's trunk will allow the water Vah Ruta is sprouting to aim down at the flames, putting the fire out and making the terminal accessible. This one, again, has a great concept, but was not expanded to a great extent. This is probably the second hardest terminal in terms of deciding what to do, but in any case, it was still relatively easy. The average player should spend no more than 2 to 3 minutes deciphering this. The final one requires you to visit a platform and aim Vah Ruta's trunk down, so when you fly to it, you have enough height to land. Once you do land, simply raise the trunk again while moving onto the platform to access the terminal. Now, this is one of the terminals that follows a theme that every Divine Beast follows, and that is forcing the player outside. Yes, Nintendo, I recognize that this is a consistency and I appreciate the scale of the beast in the view of Hyrule, but this is still a pitifully easy and simple terminal that should have had more complexity, to say the least. The average player should take no more than 2 minutes figuring out the setting that will give them access to the trunk and then the terminal. All in all, I spent a total of 10 minutes replaying this easy-ass Divine Beast. On my first run in 2017, I'm not gonna lie, I looked it up. But my mindset was much different back then. I was still making Call of Duty videos and would have never thought to actually put in the effort to solve puzzles without looking it up. But that's what we're doing for Tears of the Kingdom. Anyways, at this point, you have enough height to easily access all of the chests, and I'm not going to explain how to get each individual Divine Beast chest because they don't even add much of a challenge to the Divine Beast or the puzzles. Now, the boss fight is that of Water Blight Ganon. This is an easy-ass boss fight, okay? It's an easy-ass boss fight now, and it was an easy-ass boss fight 6 years ago. If you know how to backflip dodge and side dodge, this fight will tuck you into bed and put you to sleep. Water Blight Ganon is an unsophisticated boss who telegraphs its moves to an extent to where my 6-year-old cousin, I mean, he's almost 10 now, but at the time he was 6, beat this without my help. The second phase of this fight was more annoying than anything, as it severely limits your movement by adding water. Your only means of walking is 4 measly platforms. Traversing the water is like being a sitting duck. And it's not like Water Blight Ganon had to be in the middle of the map. No, it chooses one of the 4 platforms to hover directly over, and it's not limited to the one that you're on. This means that if you stun Water Blight and cause it to fall down on one of the platforms, by the time you reach said other platform by either swimming or using Cryonis, it will have recovered and will teleport elsewhere. This, excuse my language, nigga will also swing his staff at you, and if you dodge and enter a flurry rush, you don't have the distance to attack Water Blight. Your best bet is to use a bunch of arrows and damage it from a distance during this phase. This nigga will also generate 5 ice blocks and can guardian laser you. All of these attacks are slow as hell and draw out the fight. All in all, Water Blight Ganon is a horrendous boss which is entirely too easy in the first half and is entirely too annoying in the second. So let's rate this Divine Beast holistically. I'm giving this a 6 out of 10. The presentation of a problem was relevant to the player but not believable in the scope of the actual game. I mean, the Zora, the water people, don't like rain? Really?
Really, nigga?
How about our neighboring town can't supply us with food as the water makes it too dangerous for them to travel up the mountains to us? But, again, this is the fault of Breath of the Wild's story and not the Divine Beast, so again, I'll say the presentation of a problem is decent. The mandatory mission was silly as hell because it was avoidable to multiple degrees and had no real meaning behind it. If we were actually forced to engage the Lionel, for instance, that would have been a different story. The boarding of the Divine Beast was alright in terms of what Breath of the Wild has to offer, but again, holistically, it was nothing special. The puzzles were coherent to a respectable degree, as Nintendo accounted for it being the most probable first Divine Beast a new player would go to, although you can travel anywhere and do any of the Divine Beasts in whatever order you'd like. Zora's Domain is the closest and easiest to get to. Despite this fact, and the fact that I appreciate the coherence of the puzzles, they were entirely too easy and unsophisticated. It hurt seeing how much more complex the puzzles easily could have been, all the while introducing cool new concepts to the player. The boss fight, featuring Water Blight Ganon, also took a note from the puzzles and remained unsophisticated. It was clear from the design of the second phase of the boss fight that it was not one that was thought through and certainly wasn't executed well. It had some cool ideas, but again, it was executed like Shaq at the free throw line. All in all, being a culmination of the shrines and puzzles, Vah Ruta is blurring the line between 10-year-old friendly and disgraceful. I'm shocked that electricity didn't play more of a role in the puzzles, pun intended. But with that out of the way, let's get on with the next Divine Beast. Vah Rudania is the Divine Beast based on a lizard. It's located on Death Mountain and is fairly visible to the eye from quite a distance, greatly increasing the player's intrigue in it. Getting to Vah Rudania actually puts a crutch on the player in a similar manner that Vah Ruta does, the difference being that it's not a result of the Divine Beast, but rather a result of the environment that it is placed in. Because Elden is comprised of lava and steep mountain, the player has no real way of getting to Vah Rudania without taking a forced path. This is because the Flamebreaker set and 99% of fireproof lizards are exclusively in Elden. This means that the journey to Rudania starts after getting the Elden Tower. There's a designated path that the player follows which has several Elden Ostriches, Rock Octoroks, and Fire Breath Lizalfos. At one point, there's even an area which contains an Igneo Talus. However, the extremely disappointing fact is that this area is easily avoidable, as the area around this area takes close to no additional stamina to traverse. This would have been a great way to give the player experience, challenge, and even a sense of accomplishment when defeating the Talus. However, if one felt unprepared, they could easily avoid the sub-boss, and in my case, treat it like a waste of time and resources. This is all the more unfortunate because at this part of the game, the player is bending to the will and constraints of the game, working to be as efficient as possible as to not run out of fireproof elixir time, which would result in the player burning alive. Because of this fact, it's actually more intuitive to avoid the Igneo Talus, which makes you wonder why it's in the middle of a mandatory path to begin with. After completing a challenge in the Southern Mine, you'll gain one of the Flamebreaker armor pieces. Once you get closer to Goron City, you start to experience the presentation of the problem. Vah Rudania somehow has the ability to smack the shit out of Death Mountain and cause volcanic boulders to erupt. These boulders are actually pretty hard to dodge, but again, just like Vah Ruta's flooding, this is uncompelling in the scope of the game. The raining of volcanic boulders only occurs once before you enter Goron City, and doesn't occur again naturally. Furthermore, they could have given us a reason as to why this is a problem for the Gorons. Maybe this messes up their mining operations, which is essential to their way of life. But it's kind of expected that we find this to be a danger to the Gorons because, you know, boulders raining down from the sky. The mandatory mission is finding Yunobo, who is in the abandoned North Mine. This is an area northwest of Goron City and requires another level of heat protection. This requires you to either buy another piece of Flamebreaker armor or stack the one that you have with a fireproof elixir. You then have to take out several Fire Breath Lizalfo archers by using cannons placed on different rocks. This wasn't particularly fun, but it was engaging, and seeing the Lizalfos get demolished by the cannon was satisfying. After this sequence, you find Yunobo, the reward for which is a relatively strong weapon, probably one of the strongest you'll have at this point in the game. But then Bluto, the chief of the Gorons, gives you fireproof elixirs for saving Yunobo. It makes absolutely no sense to be given these elixirs at this point in the game, seeing as you've bought another piece of Flamebreaker gear, or have thought of making enough fireproof elixirs for the duration of your time in Elden. But I mean, if you somehow don't have what you need, I guess here are 3 more fireproof elixirs. Thanks, Nintendo. Now, this is the only competent boarding of the Divine Beast section out of the 4. Rudania releases Guardian Sentries, which release a spotlight. If you or Yunobo walk into the spotlight, Rudania becomes agitated and smacks Death Mountain, sending down the boulders. Now, a lot of people did not like this Sentry mission, but in all honesty, it was, again, the only appropriate lead up to boarding the Divine Beast. Yunobo doesn't control terribly, although he was the reason why we got caught this one time, but all in all, you need to strategize and time your actions. There's also a bit of mandatory combat, as there will be black moblins guarding the cannons you'll use to damage Vah Rudania. This is the only Divine Beast boarding process which can be challenging and test the skills of the player. Maybe it's not the most fun, but it wasn't at any point bad or annoying in my opinion. Getting into the puzzle, you'll enter the beast and the doors shut behind you, leaving you in complete darkness. Not only is this the basis of the next section of the puzzle, but it instills a sense of dread and urgency, one that I liked feeling. Now, if this section was a little bit more hostile to the player or was present in other areas of the puzzle, then it would be an aspect I would commemorate. But because this lasts only until you activate the Guidance Stone, it was yet another missed opportunity. Because the darkness was the most diverse in terms of aesthetics, I'll address the common criticism that all the Divine Beasts looked the same. Now, in the older Zelda games, each dungeon was its own temple, whether it be a desert temple, water temple, forest temple, so on and so forth. The point is that they all had very different aesthetics as they were placed in different earthly locations. Now, I personally didn't see a need for this as I enjoyed the art style of the dungeons, and the interior of the Divine Beasts were obviously physically different. Also, the objectives were contingent on the location of the Divine Beasts. For instance, Ruta has water puzzles, Rudania has fire and flame puzzles, Medoh has wind puzzles, and Naboris has electricity puzzles. However, I can see where the desire comes from when every other Zelda game stuck to such a harmless theme. The extent of the Divine Beast maneuverability is physically moving Rudania, which causes everything inside of Rudania to tilt 90 degrees in one of 3 directions. That being said, the first terminal is unacceptably easy to complete. You literally stand in the middle of the room, tilt Rudania, and paraglide to the terminal. Granted, you had to get rid of a malice eyeball placed on the side of the terminal, but that doesn't qualify as adding depth to this quote-unquote puzzle. The second terminal I completed had you go outside and continuously rotate Rudania in order to finagle your way to the second terminal, which was placed on the very tip of one of Rudania's back arches. I mean, the view of the volcano was cool, I guess, but after attaining this terminal, I could tell that it was just a lazy thought that they actually went through with implementing. The tilting requires very specific timing in accordance to your gliding, and the platform itself didn't even look like it was meant or designed to catch the player in such an instance, making this one of the most ghetto quote-unquote puzzles in the game. The third puzzle I completed was one of the more intricate ones. The puzzle was locked behind a metal door with burnable leaves. I burned the door with an arrow using a flame that was 2 feet next to me. After burning the leaves and the piece of wood holding the metal doors in place, you have to use magnesis to open the door. And there.
What?
That's the fucking terminal. There's absolutely no way that a nigga from Nintendo, knowing damn well the Divine Beasts are supposed to be a culmination of the shrines and puzzles in one of the greatest games of all time, said, let's hide a fucking terminal behind a metal door that requires 1 arrow to move. That's not a puzzle. That's barely an intro to one, let alone 1/5 of a Divine Beast. Bro, the laziest shrines in this game require the player to take more due diligence than this shit. Are you kidding me? How the fuck are the leaves not burning if we're in the middle of a volcano anyways? Moving on, the 4th terminal requires you to bring a torch of blue flame outside before tilting the Divine Beast so you can light another flame which corresponds with a contraption. The ball will fall down the contraption and you must tilt the Divine Beast again, where the ball will fall down the rest of the contraption. You can lift the metal block at the end of this contraption with magnesis so the ball can travel out and onto the energy socket below, powering a door to the next terminal. This one required a little bit of running around, but wasn't too intricate or anything special. In my opinion, this should have been the easiest puzzle the Divine Beast had to offer, but I don't work at Nintendo. To be fair, this one in particular is the puzzle that is the least apparent and will take a bit of guesswork for a new player. I remember first doing this in 2017, and I definitely looked it up because it was my last terminal and it extended my time in the dungeon by half an hour. 5th terminal has you shoot a blue flame through a door, which will then open the rest of said door. There will be flames guarding the terminal and a giant box on the ceiling, held in place by burnable leaves and wood. Burn the leaves to get access to the metal box and use magnesis on the box to place it on the fire. Then tilt Rudania so you have a path to walk on. Tilt Rudania once again to access the terminal. This terminal could have been more complex, but overall wasn't too bad at all. There was coherent mixed with a bit of intuitiveness, which I appreciate. Again, it wasn't anything special, but it was definitely the best terminal in this dungeon. Finally, we'll get into Fire Blight Ganon. Now, the fight wasn't as bad as Water Blight by any means, but it definitely left me wanting more. The first phase of the fight was, again, highly telegraphed, and the Flurry Rush window was way too high. The second phase of the fight was a bit more interesting. You'll have to throw a bomb at Fire Blight's fire shield. His sword now leaves a trail of fire, if I'm remembering correctly, and he can throw fireballs at you, which when exploded has a massive explosion radius. All in all, this fight shouldn't be an issue for someone aged 12 or older. I wish Fire Blight's moves were faster and the area of his fire was farther, so on and so forth. This was upsetting because Fire Blight is a boss that had the complexity and merit to be difficult, but just wasn't. Holistically, I'm giving Vah Rudania a 7 out of 10. The presentation of a problem was pretty good, but the execution of it was trash. I mean, imagine if Vah Ruta created torrential rainfall only one time in your lead up to it. The mandatory mission didn't particularly stand out and didn't provide a memorable experience, but it wasn't lackluster and provided the player with an additional gameplay feature. The boarding of the Divine Beast provided a challenge that required skill, timing, and execution, mixed with some light combat. It was annoying to some, but I mean, let's just be real. Sentry missions are just universally hated, despite what game it's in. Objectively speaking, this was an appropriate mission leading up to the Divine Beast. The bulk of Vah Rudania's puzzles were either embarrassingly lazy or not very player friendly. The darkness was completely underutilized, and all the puzzles except 2 lacked an appropriate amount of complexity. Nintendo, don't ever pull this shit again. I promise you, if I see some shit like this in Tears of the Kingdom, best believe I'm making a trip up to Nebraska, bitch. The boss fight with Fire Blight Ganon had some great concepts, but was subpar with the execution. It definitely left me wanting more out of the fight, but was a slightly acceptable one. Vah Rudania's weak points resides in the laziness of its puzzles. Nigga, I could have came up with better puzzles. Anyways, this Divine Beast can be summarized as the player's lucky break. As long as you put in some hours into the game, nothing this Divine Beast has to offer will prove to be much of a challenge. The build-up wasn't perfect, but was acceptable, and the boss fight will pass for most casual players. Vah Medoh is the only Divine Beast that lacks the presentation of a problem. The Divine Beast, modeled after a giant bird, simply flies high up in the sky. For instance, all the other Divine Beasts have cutscenes where you can see the damage they're causing. However, in Medoh's cutscene, it simply flies in the sky while doing absolutely nothing. The Rito claims that Medoh shoots at them while trying to fly near it, but I, and you for that matter, have never seen a Rito fly besides Teba. I mean, technically Rivali, but he's been dead for 100 years and only appears in cutscenes. Also, the Rito would have to fly unbelievably high in order to be within the range of Vah Medoh's Guardian lasers. If we somehow are convinced that the Rito take flight on a regular basis despite never seeing them do so, there's absolutely nothing in the game which gives them a reason to fly that high to begin with. This is especially sad because Vah Medoh was possibly one of the greatest intrigues in all the game, and definitely out of the Divine Beasts. You can see Vah Medoh from almost anywhere in the game. It can pass as a landmark or point of interest within Hyrule just as easily as Death Mountain or Hyrule Castle. To have Medoh not really do anything is very disappointing. I think that Vah Medoh would have done better in Tears of the Kingdom with aerial islands. That way, Medoh could potentially affect something that it is eye level to. But here in Breath of the Wild, it's too far away to pose any real threat or create any real problem. A solution would have been for Medoh to create violent windstorms, preventing the Rito from flying effectively from where they are in Rito Village. Medoh's mandatory mission is the most pathetic in the entire roster and somehow falls below that of Vah Ruta's mandatory quest. The mission has you go from Rito Village to the flight range to see Teba. This area is just beyond Dronok's path, meaning you'll have to encounter the second level of the extreme cold. However, this is a very short distance from the flight range, which doesn't allow for a compelling journey while taking advantage of this weather condition, like the path to get to Vah Ruta and Vah Rudania. Upon speaking with Teba, he'll have you shoot 5 targets in 3 minutes with unlimited bullet time stamina. Bro, most Korok seed puzzles are harder than this. There's no way. Who the fuck at Nintendo gave this the okay? Probably the same nigga that gave this the okay. I mean, this is one of those things that are supposed to have like 3 or more tiers to them, like how they do in the Super Mario 3D World rooms, where it starts off easy and gets increasingly harder, but they just neglected to add any nuance to this mission whatsoever. I mean, Nintendo, what the hell? Actually, what the hell? Anyways, after you complete this mission that even 6-year-old little cousins found easy, you proceed to board the Divine Beast. This was undoubtedly the worst pre-boarding process. Not only does easy not even begin to accurately describe this mission, but it was also tedious. You're given bomb arrows by Teba, which again raises the question of why we had to go on a fetch quest for them during Vah Ruta. You then fly up to Vah Medoh via Teba and use the updrafts to gain even more aerial height above Vah Medoh. Vah Medoh generates this ugly ass force field which will surround it, and cannons will shoot guardian lasers at you. You have to make your way around Medoh and disable the 4 cannons, which are placed respectively on all 4 corners of its body, hence the tedious part. Not only does the updraft replenish your stamina instantly, but the lasers are more avoidable than the urge to collect all 900 Korok seeds. I mean, I don't think the lasers can hit you even if you try to make them hit you. And it doesn't help that Teba can draw their attention away from you, as though that was even remotely necessary. And at the end of the mission, you enter a cutscene where Teba leaves because his ass got hit by one of the lasers.
Looks like I got
ain't no fucking way, boy. Boy, ain't no way, boy.
I think I need to get back to the flight.
Boy, ain't no way, boy.
Like, how the fuck did you get hit? Nah. Like, what kind of shit were you smoking? Like, genuinely, how the fuck did you get hit? Okay. Actually, Teba is controlled by a real person, and this person plays an NPC, or now a PC, in your copy of Breath of the Wild in real time, but only appears as Teba. And this player also lives on the surface of Mars, so you know it's kind of difficult for the person to see your screen and avoid the lasers, which is how Teba got hit in the game. So you enter Vah Medoh, and in my opinion this needs to be the best Divine Beast as it has the potential. It's the only Divine Beast in the air, already giving it unique features that cannot be realized elsewhere in Hyrule. I'm pleased to report that Medoh doesn't have the same sort of issues that Rudania and Ruta have, but it's not too far off. Before activating the guidance stone, which gives you access to the map, you'll notice these platforms in the middle of Medoh, which move depending on how Medoh is positioned. Now, Medoh is able to tilt 45 degrees from each wing, tilting the entire dungeon in a similar manner to Vah Rudania, but not as much. These platforms serve absolutely no purpose, despite moving based on where Medoh is tilting. And if I'm mistaken, then it doesn't serve a purpose that is anywhere near meaningful. No matter how these platforms were placed, I could literally use them to walk across the beast, which begs the question, why are there all these platforms when you could have just made a bridge? I mean, seriously, I thought this was going to be part of a puzzle or something, but please don't make the same mistake I did in thinking so. The first terminal, and again, you can do whichever terminal in any order, I'm just telling you the order that I'm going in. So my first terminal, as you enter a room where the terminal is too high for Link to reach and is covered by a Malice Eye. Shoot the Malice Eye, then stand on the platform directly across from the terminal. You'll then have to tilt Vah Medoh to the right and paraglide to the terminal once you have enough altitude. I mean, I feel like a broken record. The initial puzzles are unacceptably easy, and I mean, there's nothing much more to say about this besides it's too easy to be justified being in a Divine Beast. The second terminal was a little more complex than most puzzles we have reviewed thus far. You'll intuitively send down a bomb through a see-through pipe in a room you can't yet access. This concept is something that you've been doing multiple times in shrines, including one of the 4 Great Plateau shrines, granting you access to the rest of the game. Your bomb will be stopped by a rocky surface. You'll obviously need to explode the rock so you can send another bomb through the pipe. Beside you is a switch which controls a stream of air. You'll use this to send the second bomb across the room where you must blow up a false wall. It's within this false wall that contains a massive metal ball. You'll then tilt Vah Medoh, which will cause the large ball to roll towards you, at which point you can use magnesis to move the ball in the trajectory of the large switch. Tilting Medoh again causes the ball to roll onto the switch, opening the door that was restricting your access from the room. You can now freely activate the terminal. Now, for some reason, as I was doing this, deciphering the puzzle, I felt satisfied. This is because this puzzle in particular played on something that was familiar to me, hitting switches to control things out of our control, placing bombs down pipes, and using magnesis on objects far too massive for us to maneuver ourselves were all concepts previously and heavily introduced to us. If you're doing Vah Medoh, chances are you've done multiple shrines or even overworld activities which required similar things from you. This puzzle felt natural and intuitive, which is why it's so deceiving. This puzzle really wasn't anything special, and it feels more fit to be in a shrine who would offer more components besides this specific puzzle. Like most of the other Divine Beast puzzles, it easily could have been expanded on and made more complex. It would have been more fit if once you had opened the door, you needed to enter an additional room which offered a similar, slightly more complex activity in exchange for access to the terminal. But since that wasn't the case, I'm mad at this puzzle for being so good, yet so bleak. The third terminal literally only requires you to go outside, gain height via a wind propeller while Vah Medoh is tilted, and fly down the terminal. Like, bro, I can't. Like, what was the brain power or even the skill that was required of me to figure out this puzzle? What makes this puzzle even meaningful or even worthy of being here? I know, it's the view of Hyrule. The fourth terminal, I literally just tilted Vah Medoh and froze a box with a spindle on it with stasis. I then hit a switch which opened and closed some windows which allowed for the air to flow into the room and activated the spindles that were on the boxes. I honestly don't know what I had to do to make this work. It just did. So I had to go back and do some research. So in all honesty, I'm still not entirely sure what the correlation between A and B was with this terminal, but basically the second box with the spindle had to be held in place and affected by the wind while Medoh is tilted downwards. This causes a heavy object to roll down the track on its own, which activates a giant button which grants the player the access to the terminal. Now, this doesn't look as easy as it is, so of course deciphering this puzzle is the real challenge, as the act of doing the puzzle itself wasn't that hard or complicated. But if memory serves me correctly, I do remember getting stuck on this my first time and my first few replays where I didn't look it up. But this really isn't too complex at all. The final terminal entails you going outside and riding a lift. You must then tilt Medoh and freeze the lift in place as it begins to slide down the other end of the wing. You'll then use this opportunity to shoot the Malice Eye, which is blocking your path to the next terminal. Now, this isn't too complicated, but it also wasn't that intuitive. You might think that this is a bad thing. However, when you have puzzles that aren't intuitive yet not too complicated, when you do figure it out, it gives you a genuine sense of accomplishment. I feel like there's definitely more than one way to handle this terminal other than what I just described. However, it wasn't intuitive, or to put it simply, obvious on what I should have done. Thus, when I did figure it out, it felt more interpersonal. Sometimes we need simple but unintuitive puzzles like this. The contrast between the two adds a surprising layer of depth. This is especially the case when the intuitive ways don't end up working, forcing you to think outside the box. Honestly, if more terminals were to follow this format, then the Divine Beast would be in a lesser dilemma. In conclusion, this terminal is simple yet acceptable in my book. And now getting to Windblight Ganon. Now, this boss fight was the easiest in my opinion back in 2017 when I played it. However, there was some depth that I overlooked. This sort of bothers me even more than Fireblight, because although I think that some tweaks needed to be made to Windblight, all the tools were there. With Waterblight, the fight was made boring because of highly underdeveloped concepts and the boss basically being in a perpetual state of easy mode. Fireblight Ganon had more advanced movesets that needed to be drawn out a little bit more to be a successful fight. And with Windblight, all the tools are here, except almost none of them are executed well. Rivali states that its shot is dead on, but as long as you're running horizontally, Windblight will not hit you and will miss all of its shots from point blank range. These shots should have been more accurate and should have forced the player to either parry them or cower behind the stone pillars that serve no purpose in being on Vah Medoh. Or given the information Rivali gives us in the very beginning of the fight, Windblight drawing its gun shouldn't be something that the player allows to happen. During the second half of the fight, there is this very cool sequence where Windblight shoots its drones, which will reflect the shot off of one another until it eventually aims for Link. There's also a second level to the same action, the difference being it undergoes a cooler animation. However, all of these shots were easy to dodge. Windblight also has the potential to summon a tornado or two, and this is a good implementation. This is the first thing that's difficult to dodge and deals a good amount of damage. Now, the main flaw with this fight is that there's one key strategy to win. It's very obvious that you need to travel up the fans, which propel visible wind, and enter bullet time to deal damage to Windblight's eye while you're in slow motion with the bow and arrow. Then once Windblight is stunned and on the ground, damage it with your weapon and repeat. I didn't even change the way I defended myself. I just either ran or paraglided up the wind. Holistically, Vah Medoh was the first divine beast to not give a compelling journey in the process of making our way to it, despite it being a wonder of Hyrule, so to speak. Even more so than any of the other divine beasts, as you can see it from a distance from almost any location. There was no presentation of a problem other than the dialogue of the Rito claiming that they were somehow affected by Vah Medoh flying around. The mandatory mission as well as the boarding process of the divine beast was sorry in every aspect. The divine beast itself was a slight step up from what we saw in Ruta and Rudania. With it being in the air, we got better puzzles, but like my boy Captain Price said, it's an improvement, but it's not hard to improve on garbage. The boss fight was the most realized that we have gone over thus far, but the battle zone was underutilized, and us as the player are forced into a boss fight which will play out almost identically from player to player. I'm giving this a 7.5 out of 10. Although the first half of the Divine Beast, i.e. the mandatory mission and the boarding process, was basura, the Divine Beast puzzles were a slight step forward, as some were intuitive and others weren't, but were contrasted with its simplicity. The more complicated terminal puzzle, unlike Vah Rudania, didn't require running around the entire Divine Beast. The boss fight had the most interesting moveset at its disposal out of anything that we've gone over thus far, but should have allowed for more player agency in terms of dealing with it. Vah Naboris takes the form of a giant camel and stomps in circles in the East Barrens. Because of the flat terrain of the desert, you'll be able to see its roaming from pretty much anywhere, in the desert that is. This creates the presentation of a problem, a sandstorm. Now, I would say that this is corny since again, it's happening far away from the Gerudo. However, this physically limits your access as the player to a good part of the desert, so I can't write it off completely. Entering Gerudo Town itself was quite memorable, as we all remember very well dressing Link up as a female just to gain access to the town. Once you do enter the town, you're told to retrieve the Thunder Helm, which will make your boarding of Vah Naboris a lot less painful to the in-game Link. The Thunder Helm was stolen by the Yiga clan, whose hideout is at the end of Karusa Valley, aka the innermost portion of a mountain which separates the desert and the rest of the overworld. This is easily the best mandatory mission, as it requires you to traverse the desert and infiltrate an entire secluded enemy base. This is the Yiga clan hideout, and you'll have to sneak past all the Yiga Blade Masters who serve as guards. Funny enough, they can be distracted by using bananas. The only flaw of this mandatory mission for me was that you could skip most of it using the ceiling. If we were forced on the ground, this would definitely be a more challenging mission. The end of this mandatory mission even ended with a boss fight, albeit a very easy one, but nevertheless, a boss fight. Compare this mandatory mission with shooting 5 fucking targets in slow motion. Bro, I can't even. After this, you'll board the Divine Beast. This entails riding a sand seal along with Riju all the way to the East Barrens. The Thunder Helm will provide a visible barrier with an area of effect that will protect you from Vah Naboris' lightning attacks. Staying within this barrier with Riju, who is wearing the helm, is tangible, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that staying within this area of effect is a lot more tedious than what it needed to be. You have to awkwardly increase and decrease the speed in which your sand is moving, as your sand seal will move faster than Riju when dashing, but much slower when moving normally. And given the fact that those are the only 2 movement options for the sand seal, it makes it, again, tedious. Take this and the added objective of shooting Naboris' feet. It looks almost as messy as you follow through with the objective, as you will probably fall outside of the protective area of the Thunder Helm as you aim with the bow, unless you have 4 hands or something like that. But I mean, this boarding of the Divine Beast process isn't too hard. I literally dashed outside the barrier and took care of Naboris within 30 seconds. This is probably the second worst boarding process. It sucks because it was an awesome concept, and I even had a little fun traversing the desert in such a manner, but the implementation of the design turned out with awkward controls and a very easy objective. Once you do enter the Divine Beast, actually getting the Guidance Stone can be pretty confusing. The platforms that lead you there will leave you confused on whether or not you can access them on foot, but you can. This is probably the time to mention that during my first time replaying this Divine Beast this year, it took me about 2 hours, as I insisted on not looking up anything. This really puts things into perspective from the lens of a new player. It just goes to show how much you really need to think and actually use your brain for this Divine Beast, and this is something to be commemorated by Nintendo. This is the standard that each Divine Beast should have been held to. With that, let's go over the terminals. The Guidance Stone allows you to move 3 different sections or chambers of Naboris' stomach, if you will, in a 360-degree fashion. You can rotate each of these 3 chambers 120 degrees at a time. In each of these 3 sections, the floor is lined with an electric bar. If you line up all these bars with the upper portion of the Divine Beast, then you carry out an electrical current which will power the front of the Divine Beast. But before we even get there, you'll need to go outside Vah Naboris and turn the front chamber of the stomach. Your access to this first terminal is dependent on the position of the first chamber. The area leading into the terminal room will be open when the chamber is in a certain position. When entering the room, however, the terminal will be on the side of the room and out of your reach, meaning you'll have to rotate the chamber again until you're level with the terminal, activate it, then turn the chamber again to exit the room. This terminal wasn't too complicated, so I won't act like it was anything great. However, how you had to rotate the chamber to gain entrance, then again to activate the terminal, then again to exit, makes it a decent terminal. This terminal was also guarded by a Guardian Scout, making it one of the few with almost mandatory combat. Once you do what I described prior in terms of lining up all the electric bars, the front of the Divine Beast will begin to spin, giving you access to the platforms, which will bring you to the upper portion of the Divine Beast. It's here where you can activate the second terminal. This was obviously a weak terminal, which just rewarded you for figuring out something that you had to do to complete the Divine Beast. Anyways, you'll need to fly to the other side of the Divine Beast now. After figuring out and maneuvering an electricity contraption, a platform or the tail of Naboris will raise, giving you access to an even higher level. However, if you activate the contraption too early, then the tail will prevent you from accessing the platform. In my case, I used stasis on the electric block. However, I think Nintendo wanted you to move the chambers when you were ready, as the electricity on top of the chambers connects with this contraption, in turn powering the tail. You have to shoot a Malice Eye and then proceed into the elevator rooms. In the elevator rooms, you'll have to access the upper level and turn a crank which will power another elevator which moves horizontally to the other elevator room. This second elevator room holds the third terminal, where you must shoot a Malice Eye placed under the terminal. This Malice Eye is blocked by another elevator which moves vertically and also holds another Guardian Scout. This terminal was very good for the obvious reason that it included major in-between puzzle solving to even access. The fourth terminal requires you to ride the elevator up to the maximum floor, grab an electric metal ball, then after you have that ball, go back to the first elevator room, grab another electric metal ball that's hidden right under the floor you were standing on. You'll then go to the bottom of the second elevator room and activate a switch with an electric metal ball. This gives you access to the room that holds the fourth terminal. However, it's guarded by 2 Guardian Scouts. After taking care of these Guardian Scouts, there will be 2 electricity pedestals for you to place the 2 balls. This will power the door and open it, giving you access to the terminal. In terms of figuring out what to do and exploring the upper portion of Vah Naboris, this is definitely a good terminal. The only flaw is that it's drawn out by waiting for the elevators. The final terminal involves you going back to the front of Vah Naboris, which should still be powered by electricity and thus should still be spinning. This will give you access to the neck of Naboris, where you must power 2 switches with the use of a crank. These 2 cranks will power Naboris' neck, raising it vertically, on the back of which is an elevator. This elevator will bring you to the top of the terminal. This wasn't the most complicated, but it definitely wasn't the worst terminal by any means. If this appears in Tears of the Kingdom, I would expect a terminal of this caliber to be the easiest one in a given dungeon. Now to review the boss you've all been waiting for, Thunderblight Ganon. This is definitely the hardest out of the 4 blights and is notorious for being so. Although the statement is objectively true, there's still some shortcomings. For one, as long as you genuinely know what you're doing, then Thunderblight actually isn't too much of a problem in the grand scheme of video game bosses you'll fight. The first and overall worst part of this boss fight is the arena. Although it was very meticulously thought out for the puzzle, it makes for one hell of a terrible terrain to fight Thunderblight on. Thunderblight's first move is a dash at you with insurmountable speed, prompting you to either evade or backflip at the very last second. And I do mean the very last second, as it blatantly won't work sometimes. This is a stark contrast between Fire and Waterblight's Flurry Rush window, both of which were jarringly too large. I prefer this short window that Thunderblight gives you, but I do think it's just a bit inconsistent. Getting back to the arena, mind you, we start this fight off by activating the Guidance Stone, the platform leading up to which being very narrow and not ideal for fighting such a boss. And if you have played Breath of the Wild, you'll know that it isn't just a combat game, but also a game for exploration. This promotes the fact that you'll have to be within a certain range of an enemy for the game to even acknowledge its existence. What I'm getting at is by jumping down from the narrow platform and down to the ground, the game no longer acknowledges that I'm fighting a boss. This means that when I press the block button by simply jumping down maybe 15 in-game feet, I was too far away for the block button to work, as you have to be within a certain range for it to lock onto an enemy. This leaves you completely open to Thunderblight's teleportation attacks. So just stand on the platform, you might say. But then that's a compromise I would have to make due to the game not acknowledging that I'm currently fighting a major boss that it put in front of me. I think it was kind of ghetto and not very well thought out that I couldn't lock onto Thunderblight at this point of the fight. Moving on to a plus, evading Thunderblight leads to a pretty satisfying moment in gaming, and it's definitely a highlight of Breath of the Wild's combat.
Well done.
It's like Kratos finally being able to punch Heimdall. Moving on to another downside, however, were those measly ass 3 fireballs that Thunderblight throws at you. It's almost laughable how weak that attack is being outputted by a relatively strong opponent. Imagine a Lionel digging into the ground and throwing a rock at you, like how a bokoblin would when it can't reach you. Another thing I like about this boss fight is that Thunderblight will change its attack pattern after you damage it a bit. It'll swing its shickle at you multiple times if you fail to dodge or parry the attack. The second phase of this fight starts off with Thunderblight summoning metal pillars, which it'll then electrify. Use magnesis to pull a pillar out of the ground and hold it directly under Thunderblight as it electrocutes the pillar, dealing a little more damage than necessary to itself. This process is a little tedious and may even warrant you missing the first sequence of this attack, prompting you to do a second one, and rightfully so. Now you'll find the rest of this fight pretty difficult if you don't start shooting Thunderblight with bomb arrows immediately. It's the same as before, but Thunderblight may recover and attack you while it's at a distance too far for you to lock onto it, leading to the same problem I mentioned before. And given the fact that it can hit you multiple times now, this can lead to a very unfair death. Anyways, Thunderblight's attacks are now electrified, disabling you of your weapons if you get hit. Thunderblight's attacks are also now more aggressive, and if you don't kill Thunderblight but get it extremely low, Thunderblight will use a Guardian Laser. So in conclusion, this was a pretty good boss fight with some terrible terrain, which brought out a flaw in Breath of the Wild's targeting system. I like how we progressed from boss to boss from this review. Water Blight was too easy, with cool but underdeveloped concepts. Fire Blight had developed concepts that weren't executed properly. Wind Blight had really cool concepts, subpar execution of them, and one predominant strategy for victory. Finally, with Thunder Blight, we have good concepts and good execution of them, which is why Thunder Blight's fight is infamous for being much harder than the rest of them. All in all, I'm giving Naboris a 9 out of 10. This is the standard that Nintendo should have held themselves to with every single Divine Beast. I think this one was the most advanced and held the hardest Divine Beast, with the assumption that Naboris would probably be the last Divine Beast one would go to. Nevertheless, the mandatory mission was the best out of the entire game. The presentation of a problem was suitable. Of course, it could have been more impactful or apparent, but it works. The mandatory mission involving sneaking into the Yiga clan hideout is definitely the best out of the 4 that we were given. The boarding of the Divine Beast process was something that would have been more fun if the controls were properly fleshed out. The Divine Beast puzzles itself was the best and easily fit the standard of acceptable and almost exceptional when looking at Zelda dungeons as a whole. This was easily better than a lot of the dungeons from games like Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess. And obviously, the boss fight was the best out of the bunch. With some better terrain, it would have been an objectively great boss fight, but instead, it's objectively decent. Getting into the summary, in terms of the Divine Beasts serving as dungeons, and again, I'm not holding them to the standard of older Zelda games dungeons, but as a culmination of the puzzles in Breath of the Wild, they overall did a pretty poor job. People like to say that they were mid, which is a word that gets thrown around way too often, especially in the gaming community, so I'm gonna say they were serviceable at best. As something that is supposed to be the highest representation or pinnacle of a major component of a game to Breath of the Wild scale, again, they did not do a very good job. Like I said earlier, a good portion of the shrines had better puzzles than the puzzles contained in the Divine Beast. Of course, I appreciate the scale of the Divine Beasts. How some puzzles are seamlessly integrated with some of the body parts of the Divine Beasts, I think that was genius. The ability to control a part of the Divine Beast's body with simple controls, yet leading to substantial physical changes, is a great concept. Unfortunately, the bulk of the Divine Beasts were merely 5 shrine puzzles, just expanded to a larger scale. The larger scale of the Divine Beasts did not positively correspond with the difficulty or complexity of the Divine Beast puzzles. When presented with the challenges the puzzles provides, they are either inexcusably easy or easily could have been more drawn out and or complex. You'll have some good puzzles here and there, however, these puzzles are the minority within the Divine Beasts, except for Naboris. Likewise with Naboris, it was the only Divine Beast whose chests provided appropriate and engaging additional gameplay. The rest of the Divine Beast chests could be easily accessed without much thought or on the way to or from a given terminal. Looking at the Divine Beast holistically, it is very much a shame that Breath of the Wild goes out of its way to build up your interest in the Divine Beast just to give you half-baked puzzles. Don't get me wrong, completing the Divine Beast puzzles is not an unenjoyable experience. I would go as far as to say that overall, it's a satisfying experience. It's just that they fall short on what they're supposed to represent. Of course, except for Vah Naboris, my overall criticism doesn't apply to Vah Naboris. Just keep that in the back of your mind. If we take a look at the 5th Divine Beast from the DLC, you'll see what's supposed to occur within a Divine Beast. Complex puzzles, which requires a pensive attitude. A mix of combat with each terminal progression. All the while, it keeps the positive aspects of the Divine Beasts. A simple physical change that is controlled by the player, which creates an altering of the puzzles in their entirety, and a large scale. The only thing that was missing was that it wasn't a wonder of Hyrule, a giant machine overlooking an entire region. When I look at criticism for the Divine Beast, a similar thing comes to mind as when I hear criticism of Infinite Warfare. You guys are rightfully upset, but for all the wrong reasons. The Divine Beast looking the same is not validated due to the fact that all of them had different designs. Designs in which the player had to engage with heavily as it progressed them further and further through the Divine Beasts. For example, Divine Beast Vah Ruta is an elephant, and you need to maneuver its trunk to progress to the majority of the terminals. Furthermore, each dungeon held its own attribute in its puzzles. Vah Rudania, who was in the middle of Death Mountain, a literal volcano, had predominant puzzles which involved fire. The same can be said about Naboris with the electricity, Ruta with the water, and Medoh with the wind. I understand that the older dungeons were correlated with the environment, so the extent in which the older dungeons were diversified visually was greater than that of Breath of the Wild, but a good dungeon isn't contingent on the fact that it looks different from one another. This is a criticism that would have never existed had the older Zelda games not been so diverse with their dungeon settings, as that was the main way for the games to stand out from one another. Furthermore, they didn't make their own iteration of Jomon Japanese art, foreign art style, to not use it. I can understand the complaint, but it's fairly trivial and shouldn't be an actual critique of the Divine Beast, and should probably just be a personal nitpick. Combat being in the dungeons is a little more valid, however. I'm a proponent of the idea that dungeons should be more about puzzle solving and less about fighting enemies. It should be a 70 to 30% ratio at most. I think again how the 5th Divine Beast handled the combat was perfect. That being said, the enemies in the Divine Beast were very weak and served as busy work instead of engaging combat. I didn't mind how few enemies were in the Divine Beasts, but at least make the enemies that are showing up on my screen worth my time instead of making me roll my eyes at the fact that they are present. The final common critique that I'll address were the bosses. Yes, they did look the same, sound the same, and if you couldn't tell by watching the prior moments in this video, I am mostly disappointed in them. This is a very valid critique of the dungeons, as they're supposed to end off by giving you a memorable experience with the boss fight. But aside from Thunderblight, you're not getting that here. The bosses did look generally the same when they could have been made to look different. That's also a fair criticism, seeing how diverse all the other bosses were in the older Zelda titles. Boss design is a little more significant than dungeon setting, just in case you're prepared to call me out for being a hypocrite for not caring about the dungeon's interiors not being heavily diversified. All in all, I'm not interested in how the Divine Beasts compare to the older Zelda dungeons. Aside from a few aspects, you can't really hold them to the same standard. However, the Divine Beasts failed to hold up to the standard Breath of the Wild set for them. The puzzles, with the exception of Naboris, were generally lackluster. The lack of enemies or combat wasn't a concern of mine. Maybe they could have added a few more in, but the real problem is that the enemies that were included in the Divine Beasts are a nuisance. You might as well have added Keese in the dungeon. And finally, Hyrule Castle is a location, not a dungeon. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know in the comments down below and with your like or dislike rating. We are about a month and a half away from Tears of the Kingdom releasing, and when it does release on May 12th, we will be live streaming the game on YouTube for 24 hours straight, so make sure you pop in for that. But before then, subscribe for more Tears of the Kingdom content and more content in between, such as Splatoon 3 and Resident Evil and stuff like that. Anyways guys, I'll see you in the next video.